Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced at North Idaho College on the shores of Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guest.
Welcome to a two-week series. We do a lot of those, and the subject we have today is from a very different angle or approach than one often hears the issue of diversity. Our topic is white men in the world of diversity. Our guest is Michael Welp. He now lives in Idaho. He comes to us with a very extensive educational background. He holds a BS degree in psychology from Iowa State University. He has a master's in organizational development from American University in Washington, D.C., and he holds a doctorate in organizational development from the Fielding Graduate University at Santa Barbara. Dr. Welp, welcome to our program. We're delighted to have you here. And
thank you, Tony.
Fascinating subject, and we're going to pursue a lot of issues over the next 2 weeks. And as always, I'm very pleased to have Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, as our panelist, and she will commence today's questioning.
Welcome to the program today.
Thank you.
We're going to talk some about diversity and about white men as a part of a diverse population. What made you get interested in this particular subject?
Well, it was really my own diversity learning journey, Janelle, that started that. I grew up in Iowa in the Midwest and lived for some time in Minnesota, and I eventually lived in Washington, D.C., and it was then I started learning about issues around race and gender. And I found that there were whole worlds of issues that I had not really been exposed to growing up in the cornfields of Iowa. And I got really curious about diversity issues, and particularly why was it challenging for me to understand them as a white man. So I ended up going over to South Africa and living there for a year, and I facilitated interracial team building. I had a background in Minnesota as an Outward Bound instructor, so I went over to the Outward Bound school there, and they had mining groups doing interracial team building. So it was right after Nelson Mandela was released, and it was an exciting time. And I found that I had more in common with the white men there than I realized I would. You know, I had a culture that I didn't even know I had that sort of permeated, and they were nice. They were actually nice men, like I see myself as, and yet they were also perpetuating a system of inequality. So I realized, you know, I really need to come back to my country and work with people who look like me. And so I came back and I did a doctorate dissertation studying how do white men learn about diversity? What triggers our awareness? What triggers our activism? And I found several things. One is that most of us learn almost everything we know from white women and men and women of color, and which is a huge burden on the rest of everybody to educate us, white men. So I realized one of the leading edges in diversity is how do you get white men to educate each other? How do you get them and us to learn from each other? So the burden isn't on everybody else to do that. And so a colleague of mine, Bill Proudman, and I started putting groups of white men together for 3.5 days in a program called the White Men's Caucus. And it's been an adventure ever since then. That was about 10 years ago.
And you have a business now that you work from.
Right.
You go around the country giving programs, I take it, and seminars about this subject.
Yeah, now our organization is called White Men as Full Diversity Partners. And it's a consulting firm. We work with a lot of organizations and government and corporate agencies. And it's a niche that's missing in a lot of the diversity field.
Thank you.
I'll follow up on Janelle's questions. I do find this subject and your approach fascinating. I assume as very few people have focused on this from this perspective. I would like for you to share with us what you call 6 themes of white male culture, and from that later we'll get into, it sounds like to me, knowing that first is the first step in working with white men in this whole field of diversity. So if you would take us, our viewers, through those 6.
Well, I would say a lot of people aren't used to focusing on white male culture or even on white men and diversity. Because when you think about diversity, say you're looking at race, the focus is on people of color. And when you're thinking about gender, the focus is usually on women. Same with other dimensions, sexual orientation, you're looking at gay, lesbian, bisexual focus. And so this unexamined piece of diversity is about heterosexual white men. And so when we start all of a sudden having a focus on it, it's unusual, it feels a little awkward. So if your listeners actually are reacting a little bit to white male culture, that's normal.
I'm sure when I introduced the program, I said, what's this going to be about?
Right. What is this? In our history of looking at the words white men together aren't always positive. There's a lot of association with that term. So, and one of the things we as white men don't realize is that we have a culture. We think of ourselves primarily as individuals. And that, by the way, is the first tenet, is rugged individualism. And so those 6 traits that I'll name, as you've requested, are just our view of looking at just some of the core tenets of what we call white male culture. And individuals vary, and we're all unique, and we often carry these threads. So the rugged individualism, that we can make it on our own, has a sort of a gender element of it. For God's sakes, don't ask for directions when you're out driving. And an ethnicity perspective too. Collectively, we're in the U.S., we are one of the most individualistic cultures in the world. We say the squeaky wheel gets the grease. In a collectivist culture like Japan, they might say the nail that sticks up gets hammered down.
And so our rugged individualism and white men are at the head of that.
Right.
More than anyone else in society.
Right. So we tend to not try to ask for help. We try to go out and do things on our own. And we also can play in teams, but we want to carry that individualism. And culture is always learned from
for like a time, can we move to number 2? These are all so interesting.
Okay. Low tolerance of uncertainty. So things are either or. You're either with us or you're against us. It's that's a Calvinistic background of black-white thinking. And, with diversity as a white male, I just want to know what the rules are. Just tell me what the rules are. Tell me what to say. Tell me what not to say. And so the challenge is I have to learn to accept the complexity and the confusion around diversity, and that there aren't any clear rules anymore.
So if you can remove the uncertainty with white men, then the tolerance will be different.
Actually, I think it's really helping white men learn to cope with and accept the uncertainty as their friend.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually, there's a lot of uncertainty out in the world and a lot of ambiguity. So
more complex world than ever.
Right. If we learn to tolerate it around diversity, it's a leadership skill to be able to tolerate it with everything.
And number 3?
Action over reflection. Is that what I have on that list?
It's been titled sometimes favoring action over reflection.
Right. It's doing over being. And that's a core that we're great problem solvers. Put a man on the moon in 10 years. Do incredible things with that can-do attitude. And it's really a charge ahead, and we tend to want to fix things. And part of the doing this, we define our identity by that too. I say, hi, I'm Michael, I'm a consultant. I just define who I am by my profession. If I'm from Africa, I might say, my name's so-and-so, I'm from such and such village, my parents are so-and-so. Nothing in my identity by what I do. So there's a pride and an element of action orientation.
I was also very interested in number 4 when you talk about rationality over emotion. That, I guess that's one of the contrasts in the gender issue, is that a lot of women are oftentimes questioning that men seem to have more difficulty in expressing themselves from an emotional perspective.
Right, and there's an assumption that if I am emotional, I'm no longer rational. Again, that low tolerance of uncertainty, so it's an either or. So I better not show emotion because I'm no longer going to be rational, as opposed to a lot of other cultures, you can be fully rational and emotional at the same time.
This is, again, so interesting. Do you also see in your workshops and your consulting that white men often think that by being emotional, it makes them look weak?
I think so. I think there's an element of internalized homophobia for most of us. growing up on a playground, and we want to be fit in and be one of the guys.
And never sissy.
Right, and if you don't fit in that box, that you act tough, you get called either feminine or gay terms as a way to push you back, socialize to stay back in the box. So we start to disown that sort of emotional side of ourselves, and there's a price we pay for that.
Again, your in-depth work is so interesting because these are not the kind of structure that you hear much in society. Number 5 is time is linear and future focused.
So that one, we in America really focus on the future. We say to folks in the Balkans, why don't you just get over it and start working together? And they're like, well, what happened, 200 years ago? And there's countries in the Middle East that remember what happened 5,000 years ago as if it was yesterday. We don't even remember the 5 most important dates in our history. So we future focus, and then we think linearly. Time is money, so we have a sense of really that you need to keep focusing and making progress on your problem solving and everything, because we're going to run out of time. I can tell you where that comes from, too, in some ways. If you think back historically, culture, again, is always learned in a context. In North Europe, you had how many months to grow crops? Think about it, about 3 or 4 months. And so you learn a sense of linear time. If I don't get the crops in, I'm not going to survive here. And in other countries, you can grow crops all year round, Central America, Africa, so you learn a cyclical sense of time.
It's very different. And number 6, you talk about status and rank over connection.
Mm-hmm. And that's a little more trickier to describe, but it's Deborah Tannen's an author about men and women's different linguistic styles. And what shows up is that we pay attention to whether an interaction moves either one of us up or down in our status and rank. And women tend to focus on connecting and emphasizing the sameness as opposed to the status differences. And success looks like connecting and finding common ground.
Thank you so very much, Janelle Burke.
I've often heard people say, as a white male, that they are forgotten. They're the forgotten piece of the puzzle, if you will. They don't think diversity applies to them. They think the attention is all on other folks, someone perhaps of race or perhaps gender. But white males are forgotten. How do you answer that question?
I think in the way diversity has been framed, it is true that white men are forgotten or unexamined aspect of diversity. And again, it's the way that we've been framed, where you do focus on people of color, women, and other dimensions. And so it is important to sort of expand that perspective for several reasons, to look at, what does it mean to be white and male and heterosexual, if I'm heterosexual, and how do I have a different experience than you on a day-to-day basis? Do you and I have a different experience feeling safe jogging at night, out in the dark? Or do you as a woman have a different level of concern about your safety? And if I don't ever look at that, then there's a whole piece of diversity that I'm kind of blind to, a whole piece of other people's reality too. So there's something in that. And I would say first to white men that, you've been excluded from the lens of diversity. And there's something there for all of us to look at around that.
Do you think they're endangered? Do you think white men as a culture, that culture is endangered?
I don't think we're endangered. I think we are embedded in most power structures and organizations and throughout society. And our culture that I mentioned before, those 6 tenets, which are my definition of them, those are overlaid in most corporations, in most organizations. So one of my advantages is I never have to leave my culture. It's most everywhere. It's even in my church. So but if I don't never have to leave it, then I'm not aware of it as a culture. So the downside is I'm not aware that I even have a culture. And again, if diversity doesn't ever focus on white men, I'm not going to be encouraged to look at this hidden aspect of myself.
Thank you.
I'm learning a lot from your expertise, and it just really creates a lot of questions, which we'll continue to pursue today and next week. I hear from what you're saying, and you're working so closely with groups of white men, that it helps one understand why a lot of white men have been so defensive. Take us to that next step then, where as you're assisting white men to examine their own culture, what are your results? Are you finding that men are eager to do this, and then if they are, the results that then they have a different view then of other forms of diversity?
Well, eager isn't the word I would use generally across the board. I mean, some men I find are really eager, and others are really resistant, fearful what they're going to find out. And a lot of white men are angry for the feeling of exclusion or the fear or the experience that they would describe as reverse discrimination. So feeling like the jobs are going to everybody else. And so sometimes when I work with white men, and I work with some in different power utilities around the country, and I typically I work with groups of white men or mixed groups for about 3.5-day periods. And we get into more a deeper conversation like we are now. And I find some men eager, some men very resistant, and across the board, all kinds of reactions. And once we are into the journey, they discover that I'm not about placing blame or shame on anybody. They get pretty introspective and open up quite a bit.
That really triggers a thought for me, is that when you're going to work with a corporation or whatever the group may be, education, whatever, it would seem to me that your first great challenge would be in communicating that you have not arrived to tell white men that, in other words, you're not saying to them, we're not going to talk about your culture, we're going to really condition you to how you deal with racism and all. So, in my scattered question, how do you open that door when you're about to arrive? It seems to me that that would be your number one obstacle, is how you communicate what you're really about.
Well, one of the things to do in a longer time period with a group of men or a group of employees is to build a really clear understanding of what the purpose is of our time together and build some clear ground rules or operating agreements. And one of them is for people to choose their level of participation in the learning process and to know that their voice is valid. And I like to tell people that none of their perspectives are wrong. All of our perspectives are likely incomplete. We don't all see the whole picture. And so the more we can have different viewpoints in the room, great. The more of a bigger sense of the whole we're going to get. And I think there's something about my style and my colleagues' style that puts people at ease too. Because one of the things we do different, which is different than your typical facilitator, is we talk about our own learning too. We talk about our confusions as well as white men around diversity. And that just gives more permission for other white men to go to that place.
Give us another couple of examples of what you communicate. That one is really clear, that you're inviting each one to come and participate from their own perspective, not feeling defensive or threatened. What else do you, a couple other things that you share to get the whole process really going forward?
One of the things we do in the White Men's Caucus is talk about what hopes do you have. Ask people, what hopes do you have for the learning process here? What fears do you have? And what did you tell other people about what you were coming to? Did you write White Men's Caucus on your calendar, electronic calendar, and have that broadcast to the organization? And if not, why?
Is this associated with the KKK?
Exactly. So there's definitely a fear and an anxiety around the topic of white men and diversity, and we try to bring that into the room and talk about it as a way to help demonstrate and show that we're going to have a different conversation than you typically have.
It's very helpful. Janelle Burke.
Are you trying to change culture, or are you trying to get an understanding of culture? And how do you fit the two together, change versus understanding?
That's a great question, Janelle. I'd say we start with understanding and start with also knowing that when we describe a culture, such as white male culture or Euro-American culture, as some people like to call it, we're not saying any of that is bad. Culture has upsides and downsides. And so it has great tenets. I don't want to lose my tenacity, my rugged individualism. And you might see that culture as a box that we all grow up in, and I mean all of us, because even other folks besides white men see those tenets in organizations often as a definition of success. The first time I presented those 6 tenets to executives at Shell Oil, the first response out of somebody's mouth was, well, that's our performance appraisal system. So that they get embedded as the definition of success, not just for white men, but for everybody. So in terms of understanding and change, my sense is to not say, this is bad, we have to change it, because there's great things about it. And here's the general concept, is that any strength overused can become a weakness. So if I'm a rugged individualism, I never ask for help, that becomes a weakness. So where do I overuse that? Only define myself as a problem solver, action. I don't stop to reflect. Any of those things, only in my head, not in my heart. So where am I overusing it? And where's the culture in our organization encouraging us to over-apply that strength? And so the change is to not overuse it and to not be limited to just being in that box. And so to have other behaviors as well. I can ask for help. I can show and connect to my own emotion. I can stop and reflect. I can get out of a linear sense of time driving me so fast. And I can get out of a status and rank and be more connecting at times when I want to. So it's really about choice. I encourage white men and everybody to reclaim the choice about who they want to be, regardless of what's in the box and out of the box.
Again, it's very non-threatening. I'm going to pause for a moment because we do these programs and people want to get in touch with our guests, and so you've been nice to give us your website. So they're going to put the website up on the screen. And for those who might be in another room watching, if you'll verbalize what your website is for our viewers, please.
So it's the acronym for our organization, White Men as Full Diversity Partners, so WMFDP.com.
So www then, and then again, one more time for those who are grabbing a pencil.
www.wmfdp.com.
And so that WMFDP stands for the White Men as the Full Diversity Partners, and then we're at .com. So they can certainly get in touch with you through that.
Sure.
In the time we have left, I want to pursue a couple of questions and they'll lead into next week. Now that you've been doing this for some time, I believe you started in about 1996, so about 10 years. This is a long journey, and I'm sure there's a lot of other things that will develop, but what kind of feedback are you getting? Or let me assume that when you work with a particular group that after some time, do you go back and visit again, or how do you see results from your work?
Well, we stay in touch with most of our clients and like to hear how they're doing back in the workplace. And because we're not interested in just putting on a session that they like, we want to see changed behaviors in the workplace. And so we'll go back to clients and ask them, what have you changed yourself in your leadership skills around partnering with diversity? And what have you seen changed by your colleagues who were also learning with you? One of the things I remember observed about executives of Georgia Power after we worked with them, an executive leadership team, is people said they were a lot less frozen around tough issues, a lot more willing to embrace confusing issues, and willing to be courageous in speaking their truth. And that just doesn't apply only to diversity issues, but that applies to all issues. So what we have found is that the way of working on diversity issues, which is a tough issue at times, grows critical leadership skills for all the organization to work on its business better.
Also in your work, earlier in the show, we talked about some people are eager and some are not so eager. As you go up and down the organizational chart, people who are near the top in executive positions compared with those who are maybe younger and lower down but will be climbing that ladder, the corporate ladder, do you find differences in their willingness to analyze and understand their culture based on where they fit within that structure?
It's not a clear equal. What I find most veritable is their openness to learning. And what we ask is they bring that. It's okay if they bring skepticism too. Sometimes blue-collar workers are much more direct and to the point, and that's easy and fun. I like that. But I find that we're able to work with everybody. And sometimes when you have a group of white men that are mixed across hierarchy levels, that really adds a unique value to. That's neat.
Does age have anything to do with it? Those who are older, more resistant than the younger members of the organization?
Well, yeah, older white men are going to have a different kind of experience as to whether their spouse works and what kind of role models they have of women partnering with them. So they're going to have a different expectation. And a lot of younger men have their spouses working, and some even had their mom working. So they have a different mindset and they start from a different place.
Okay. Janelle Burke.
I'm hesitant to ask this question because we're about to run out of time here, but my question is, why should companies hire you to come and do that? What are the reasons that a company would hire you to come and talk with them about this subject?
Well, a lot of organizations reach a sort of a barrier. They stall out in their diversity programs because they don't know how to engage the biggest part of their organization, which is white men, both from a number standpoint and from a hierarchy standpoint, the leaders in the organization. And so this is a breakthrough. This is a different way of turning diversity inside out, and it can't help but engage. And it's for the purpose of deepening the partnerships across organizational differences. So we really create, try to embed partnership skills and leadership skills into an organization's culture. And that makes a difference in the business too. It's a lot quicker to make decisions and work on issues.
On that note, we have to bring the program to conclusion. But to our viewers, the good news is our guest, Michael Welp, will be back again next week for part 2 of this really interesting and I would indicate pioneering subject that's not been done much in the past. Again, the subject has been white men as full diversity partners in our society. And we'll continue some of these questions that we failed to get to this week when we join you again next week. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running in-house college production on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.